All I made that Thursday afternoon lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I know because I stared at the timer on my phone the entire time, willing myself not to cry until it was over. My father picked up on the second ring the way he always does. And by the time I said, "Dad, I need you," my voice had already broken. Let me back up. I had been discharged from Vancouver General at 11:15 that morning, 6 days after emergency gallbladder surgery that nobody had planned for, that had come on suddenly in the middle of an otherwise ordinary Tuesday, when I doubled over in the kitchen and couldn't stand back up. My husband, we'd been married 3 years, drove me to the ER that night, stayed until they confirmed I needed surgery, kissed my forehead, and told me he'd be back first thing in the morning. He was not back first thing in the morning. He came the next afternoon for about 40 minutes, and then he had a work thing he couldn't miss. The day after that, he texted to say he was swamped. The day after that, nothing. I lay in a hospital bed in a gown that kept falling open at the back, running a low fever, watching the IV drip, and texting him updates he responded to with, "Ok, and glad you're feeling better," and once, memorably, a thumbs up emoji. On day 5, one of the nurses, a tiny woman with close-cropped gray hair who had absolutely no patience for nonsense, looked at my visitor log, looked at me, and said, "Honey, is there someone else we can call?" I told her no, it was fine. She gave me the look that nurses give when they know your line but respect you too much to push it. By day 6, I was clear to go home. I called my husband at 9 in the morning to let him know. He said great, he was in a meeting, he'd try to come get me around 2. 2 came and went. I called again at 2:30. He said he was just wrapping up, give him an hour. At 4 o'clock, I called a third time. It went to voicemail. I sat on the edge of the hospital bed in my going home clothes, jeans that were slightly looser than they'd been a week ago, a sweater my mother had dropped off because she lived in Kelowna and couldn't make the drive herself, but she could at least courier me something warm. And I thought about calling an Uber. I thought about how the discharge instructions said I shouldn't be alone for the first 24 hours. I thought about the 6 flights of stairs in our building because the elevator had been broken for 2 weeks. I thought about how I had not eaten a real meal in 6 days and how my abdomen still pulled when I twisted wrong and how there was nobody standing in that doorway waiting for me. Then I called my father. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I told him what was happening. He didn't say much. He asked me one question. "What's the address?" I gave it to him. He said, "Don't move. I'm coming." My father lives in West Vancouver. It took him 38 minutes to get to me in afternoon traffic. He walked into that room in his work clothes. He'd left his office mid-afternoon without telling anyone where he was going. And he looked at me sitting on the edge of that bed with my small overnight bag, and he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he picked up my bag, offered me his arm, and said, "Let's get you home." "In the car," I cried. He didn't try to fix it or explain it or offer a generous interpretation of my husband's behavior. He just drove and occasionally reached over and put his hand briefly on my arm and let me talk. I said things I had been holding in for a long time, not just about the past 6 days, but about the 2 years before that. How my husband had a way of making me feel like my needs were slightly inconvenient. How I'd started apologizing for being sick before I even knew how sick I was. How the week before my surgery, I had mentioned carefully that I wasn't feeling well, and he had sighed in a specific way, not a mean sigh, just a tired one, and said, "You're always dealing with something." How that sentence had sat in my chest ever since. My father listened to all of it. He pulled into the parking garage of our building and sat there with the engine off for a moment and said, "How long has it been like this?" I didn't have a good answer. That's the thing about a slow leak. You don't notice the water rising until you're standing in it. He helped me up the stairs. The elevator was still broken. He held my arm the whole way and didn't say anything about the fact that I had to stop on the 3rd floor landing to breathe. He got me inside, got me onto the couch, looked around the apartment, the dishes in the sink, the laundry piled on the chair in the corner, the general state of a place where one person had been living as though the other one didn't exist. And he made me tea. My husband came home at 7:15. He came to the door talking, already mid-sentence about traffic on the Granville Bridge, and then he saw my father sitting in the armchair across from me and he stopped. "Sir," he said. He always called my father sir. At first I'd found it endearing. Now I just found it tactical. My father said, "Sit down." My husband looked at me. I didn't look away. He sat. What followed was not a fight. It was worse than a fight, actually. It was calm. My father has the particular ability. I've seen it in boardrooms and at family dinners and now in my own living room, to be completely, terrifyingly composed when other people expect him to be angry. He asked my husband in a measured and almost pleasant tone to explain his reasoning for the past 6 days. My husband said he'd been busy. My father asked him to be more specific. My husband talked about a project deadline, a client in Toronto, some kind of situation at work that had required his full attention. My father let him finish. Then he said, "She had surgery. She was alone for 6 days. You didn't pick her up." He said it the way you'd state a fact in a legal document. No inflection, no accusation, just the words. My husband started to say something about how I had seemed fine, how I'd been texting, how he didn't realize it was that serious. My father said, "She called me this afternoon because she had no one else to call. Your wife called her father to come pick her up from the hospital because you didn't come." He paused. "I want you to sit with that." The silence in that room was extraordinary. I watched my husband's face go through several things in the span of about 30 seconds. Defensiveness, then something that looked almost like shame, then a kind of recalibration I recognized. He was figuring out his next move. He'd always been good at that. Figuring out his next move? What he didn't know was that while he was at work that day, my father had spent 4 hours on the phone. My father is not a dramatic man. He doesn't make speeches. He doesn't threaten. But he is the kind of man who, when his daughter calls him crying from a hospital where she has been sitting alone for 6 days, does not simply drive across the bridge and make tea. He does that, yes, and then he makes calls. The first call was to his lawyer, a woman named nothing like anyone in this story, because what matters is not her name but what she said, which was that the prenuptial agreement my father had insisted on before our wedding, and that my husband had signed without reading carefully enough, was extremely clear on several points. My husband had, over the course of our marriage, slowly worked his way into a comfortable life, built entirely on my family's infrastructure. The apartment we lived in was in my name, purchased before the marriage with money from a trust my grandfather had set up for me. The car, a blue Subaru Outback, nothing fancy, but reliable in the snow, was also mine, also purchased before. My husband's salary, though decent, had been supplemented for 2 years by a job at a company my father had quietly facilitated. A word here, a recommendation there. The kind of thing that happens when you have a father who knows people and believes in giving a young couple a good start. That belief had now expired. The second call my father made was to the HR director of that company. The third was to the building manager, to remind him that the lease was in my name alone. My father sat across from my husband in our living room and explained, still in that same pleasant tone, that effective immediately, the monthly transfer my family had been making to our joint account, a detail I had not fully understood until that moment, having believed it was simply interest from my own savings, would stop, that the car insurance which ran through my father's corporate account would be cancelled at the end of the month, that the references my husband relied on for his current position came from people who returned my father's calls on the first ring. None of this was illegal. None of it was even unkind technically. It was simply my father removing, one by one, the things that had never actually belonged to my husband in the first place. My husband sat very still through all of this. I watched him. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, where he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It wasn't anger. It was the look of a person realizing, for the first time, the precise dimensions of what they had taken for granted. He said quietly, "I didn't realize." My father said, "I know." That was the whole conversation. That night, after my husband had gone into the bedroom and closed the door, My father sat with me on the couch for another hour. He didn't tell me what to do. That's the thing about him. He never tells me what to do. He said, "You don't have to decide anything tonight." He said, "You are going to be fine, regardless of what you decide." He said, "You are not someone who needs to be managed." That last one stayed with me. You are not someone who needs to be managed. Because somewhere in the past 3 years, I had started to feel like my emotions were something to be routed around, my needs a scheduling problem, my health an inconvenience in someone else's calendar. My father left at 10. He hugged me at the door for a long time. He is not typically a hugger. It made me cry again, but quietly this time. In the weeks that followed, I learned things. I learned that I didn't realize is not the same as I'm sorry. I learned that a person can be sorry and still do nothing differently. I learned that the way someone behaves when you are sick, specifically when you are sick and they think no one important is watching, is one of the truest things you will ever see about them. I also learned things about myself, that I had been making myself smaller to fit inside someone else's comfort zone, that I had mistaken his calm for stability when it was really just indifference, with good manners, that the thing I had called love for 3 years had started to feel more like a very long audition for something I was never going to get. I filed for separation 4 months after that Thursday afternoon. The prenup made it clean, which is the word my lawyer used, clean, and I have come to appreciate the coldness of that word. Because clean is what you need when something has been messy for longer than you admitted to yourself. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in March. It was raining in Vancouver, which is not unusual. I took myself for lunch at a Japanese place on West 4th that my husband had never liked. Too quiet, he always said, too slow. And I sat by the window and watched the rain come down the glass, and I ate my entire meal without apologizing to anyone for anything. My father texted me that morning, "Just thinking of you today. Call me after." I called him after. He picked up on the second ring. Some things don't change, and I have learned to be grateful for the ones that don't. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with surgery or fever or 6 nights in a hospital bed. I know that now. It's the exhaustion of spending years being reasonable about things that were never reasonable to begin with. I think about the thumbs up emoji a lot. Not with anger anymore, that passed, but with a kind of clarity I didn't have when I was inside that marriage. Because that emoji was not a small thing disguised as a small thing. It was the whole truth of what we had, compressed into one tap of a screen. My wife is recovering from emergency surgery. Thumbs up. It told me everything my gut had been trying to tell me for 2 years, and I had kept explaining it away, kept finding the generous interpretation, kept deciding that I was probably being too sensitive. I wasn't too sensitive. I was paying attention and then talking myself out of what I noticed. That's different. What I've come to understand, slowly and not without some embarrassment about how long it took, is that good judgment isn't just about being smart. It's about having the honesty to look at what's actually in front of you and call it what it is. My husband wasn't a monster. He was someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, that other people's discomfort was not really his problem to solve. And I had learned, somewhere along the way, to make my discomfort as small and undemanding as possible so as not to be a burden. Those two things fit together very neatly. That's what I hadn't understood. A dynamic like that doesn't feel like a problem from the inside. It feels like compatibility. My father saw it clearly because he was outside it. That's what I keep returning to. He didn't lecture me, didn't say, "I told you so," didn't try to make himself the hero of a story that was mine to live. He just came. He picked up on the second ring and he came, and then he did what needed to be done with the same quiet steadiness he has brought to every difficult moment of my life. There's a word for that, I think, and it isn't just love. It's integrity, doing the right thing without needing anyone to notice you doing it. And then there's the question of what I did after. The separation. The long months of sitting with an uncomfortable truth and not flinching away from it. People ask me sometimes if it was hard, and the honest answer is yes, and also no. It was hard the way anything is hard, when you've been holding a shape that doesn't fit you. But once I stopped holding it, the hard part wasn't grief. It was just the unfamiliar feeling of taking up the right amount of space. I think that's what strength actually looks like, most of the time. Not dramatic, not loud. Just the quiet decision to stop shrinking, made over and over again, on ordinary days, in ordinary rooms, until it becomes the way you move through the world. That Thursday afternoon, sitting on the edge of a hospital bed in a sweater my mother had couriered from Kulanai, I made a phone call that lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. It was the most important call I ever made. Not because of what my father did afterward, though I am grateful, I will always be grateful, but because making it meant I had finally decided that I was worth the trouble of being picked up. It turns out that's where everything else starts.